Welcome everybody out there in the internet land. We're very excited to be here with Jay Stringer, licensed mental health counselor, and we're going to talk about something that, to the best of my knowledge, nobody's talking about. What happens when you mix unwanted sexual behavior and temptation with the power of a leader's C-suite? We're going to find out, so join me. So Jay, it's so good to be with you today, and we're here in the Convene studios, and we're very excited to be with you talking about something that I don't think is being talked about a lot, so welcome.
Not nearly enough.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having me. An honor to be with Convene.
Thanks.
Yeah.
It was exciting to see Outreach Magazine picked your book, Unwanted, as Resource of the Year in, is it counseling?
And relationships.
And relationships, I think just last week.
Yes.
But you're a licensed mental health counselor, an ordained minister, and you've done some groundbreaking research where you've surveyed 3,800 men and women for your book Unwanted, helping people use their sexual brokenness and find out that it reveals a way to healing. So let's talk a little bit about some of the statistics.
Yeah.
There's some really, I would say, devastating statistics that maybe CEOs are ignoring. Certainly, I think the world is somehow ignoring. I don't know how it happened, but I think the world is ignoring the fact that pornography use doubles the chance of divorce. Porn sites have more traffic than Netflix, Amazon, and Twitter combined.
Yeah.
Speaking as a business leader,
Yes.
I wouldn't mind running a $97 billion operation, but not this porn industry. That's a $97 billion industry. 60 to 70% of people in the world are using pornography. 57% of pastors struggle with it. Pastors are resigning. CEOs are resigning. Chairman of the largest law firm in the country caught sexting with a woman he did not know. Christian men's ministry founder caught sexting. Politicians caught sexting and in jail. Hollywood casting couch being used for sexual favors to gain roles in films. Sports team owners visiting massage parlors. How did we get here? I don't know. But you've done some work that basically says your faith alone, Jesus alone, memorizing scripture alone, it's not enough. So let's talk about it.
Exactly. Yeah. So when you look at just the stats like that, I mean, sexual brokenness has become dangerously ubiquitous in our world. And yet the primary Christian approach that we have attempted to address it is just what I refer to as lust management. And so this is the classic bounce your eyes from sexual temptation. If you're having an inappropriate sexual thought, slap a rubber band around your wrist.
Yeah.
And then if you continue to struggle, part of what we advise is get into some form of accountability and get internet monitoring on your computer. And while some of these efforts do help curb unwanted sexual behavior to a small extent, as one of my friends put it recently, he said, Jay, when I've been having the same conversation with my accountability partner for 15 years, something just isn't working. And so that's, as a therapist, as a minister, part of what I realize is unless we radically change this conversation, we are going to continue to consign men and women to a lifetime of futility with this issue. And so I thought, why don't we just ask people who are struggling with unwanted sexual behavior to tell us their story?
So you did some research, 3,800 people for your master's degree. But let's just back up 1 second and say, let's define unwanted sexual behavior. I've mentioned some pornography statistics, but that's not the only thing we're talking about.
It's not the only. So I define unwanted sexual behavior as basically any dimension of your sexual life that at the end of the day you wish was not part of it.
Okay.
So that could be the use of pornography, infidelity, hookups, sexting, buying sex.
Okay.
So it's, most of the people, when they first start looking at their sexual brokenness, they might initially say, I don't want to fall into the addiction criteria. I don't think I'm an addict, but usually most people can look back over the course of their life and just see a lot of the debris of their sexual brokenness, from disrupting their marriage to losing a job, a career, something that they care a lot about. And so that's basically what I'm inviting people into is at the end of the day, it's more than likely that almost all of us have some portion of our sexual life, our sexual fantasy life, that at the end of the day, we really wish we could find healing from. And so that's what I wanted to invite people into is basically let's get a sense of how your story is shaping the sexual behavior that you want to move away from.
And we talked about what happens when you mix your research findings, 3,800 people talking about the why, with the power of an executive. What happens when those two things get mixed together?
Yes. And so part of what the research looked at was basically I invited people to tell me their whole story. So their relationship with their parents, formative experiences like trauma, sexual abuse, and then what were people dealing with in the present, whether they were an executive or not. So were they feeling stressed? Did they feel anxious? Did they feel like they had a lack of purpose? Were they dealing with a lot of futility in their career? And then I wanted to know, how does our life story and the things that we're facing actually go on to shape our brokenness? And what I can tell you is that what the research showed is that the specific fantasies that we put into the porn searches, the specifics of what we fantasize about is not random at all. It was a direct reflection of the parts of our story that remain unaddressed. And so the implication of this is really huge. It's that our sexual brokenness is actually a roadmap to healing, not a life sentence to sexual shame. But if we want it to be a roadmap to healing, we actually have to put the problem in the foreground and say, this is kind of what I'm dealing with as an executive, as a parent, as a husband, as a wife, of how do I begin to confront some of the realities of my life that at the end of the day I wish I could just kind of hide or suppress.
Let's say that again, because you said something that I don't think I've ever heard anybody say ever. Our sexual brokenness or our sexual fantasies are a roadmap to healing.
Yes.
Wow, that is incredible. It seems like most people would say, let's put a big barrier between my history and now.
Yes.
And today, I just need to stop. I just need to stop. I just need to stop.
Yes.
And it's not working.
It doesn't work. And so to me, like this is where I'm very much informed, theologically, of when you look at people in Genesis who find themselves in really difficult, broken spaces, the presence of God pursues them and asks questions. So to Adam, who has just eaten of the fruit that he was commanded not to eat from, God doesn't say, Adam, bounce your eyes from that next tempting piece of fruit. It says, Adam, where are you? What have you done? Yes. And then to Jacob, who's been struggling his whole life with issues of identity, the angel of the Lord wrestles him and just kind of says, what is your name? Which is the same, it's the question that he has not been able to answer his whole life around identity. And then we see this with Hagar too, where, she has just been traumatized by the first family of the faith, and she's about to die in the wilderness, and the angel of the Lord appears to her and asks two of the best questions any of us could ever be asked, which are, where do you come from and where are you going? And so the voice of God, if we're hearing it, is actually calling us to deeper reflection about how our sorrow and our sin came to be. So if we're in community and if we're hearing the voice of God, that really should be the question is, where are you? What have you done? Tell me where you come from and where you want to go. And so I think that's part of the point of healing is we need to become really curious about how our brokenness came to be, because right in the middle of the brokenness, there are clues into how to find healing.
So let's talk about maybe an example of that. So Convene has hundreds and hundreds of executives across the country. Their days are full of the things that the world thinks are awesome. Power, flying first class, great meals, hotels overnight in foreign cities, telling people what to do. But the truth is, executives are sometimes lonely. They're sometimes anxious. Their days are full of conflict resolution. They're feeling huge pressure, overload, fatigue. And sometimes when that day unfolds and is drawing to a close, an executive could feel that they deserve a reward, that they deserve a break. And in comes their good-looking administrative assistant, and it's game over. It's an alone space that was created that didn't have to be created. Talk about that whole entitlement thing.
Yes. So I think of entitlement like a seesaw. So if you were to think about a seesaw, a lot of us have eyes to see the kind of the addictive, compulsive choice. And that's what we see. But the other side of that is actually the role of deprivation. And so deprivation, especially for an executive, that term might say, I'm not really deprived in a lot of areas of my life. But as you just underscored, when you're feeling lonely, when you're feeling stressed, when you aren't taking care of yourself because you're too busy, you haven't invested in your family, you haven't maybe been to the dentist or the doctor for you can't even remember the last time you went, that sense of deprivation is going to set up the compulsive choice. And so that's where, just the language of Psalm 131, like a weaned child is my soul within me. And so how do executives be mindful of what their bodies are experiencing, what dilemmas they're facing, and know how to regulate themselves when they're in a really difficult spot? And so if you're not aware of what your body is feeling, and you're not aware of the complexity and difficulty that you're facing, there is going to be an immediate choice for unwanted sexual behavior, an affair, pornography, because it allows you to feel some sense of entitlement, and I can get exactly what I want when I want it because I have the power to do so.
Right. And you talk in your book about one other thing that you just alluded to a little bit, the idea that futility and lack of purpose can lead to sexual failure. So how does that happen if I'm a company with the mission statement on the wall and I just led everybody through a mission statement exercise, but maybe do I have a personal lack of purpose, a personal lack of futility?
Yes. Yeah, so men in the research were 7 times more likely to increase their involvement with pornography for each unit of a lack of purpose that they felt.
Personal purpose.
Personal purpose.
Wow.
They looked back at their life and saw a lot of failures. They looked at some of their relationships and couldn't feel like they had the life that they wanted with their partner or with their careers. And when that was your story, your involvement with unwanted sexual behavior increased by a factor of 7.
Wow.
So I think part of the uniqueness you had asked earlier just about basically the confluence of unwanted sexual behavior and power. One of the books that I brought with me that I think part of my recommendation to executives would be to read these 2 books side by side. So
I'd highly agree.
And then a book called Rising to Power. And the authors of this are Ron Crucci and Eric Hansen. But they did a 10-year longitudinal study on over 2,700 executives. And very similar to Unwanted, they found that the problems that executives are facing are not random. So one of their findings was that over 60% of executives did not feel prepared for the strategic challenges that they had to face when they moved and were appointed to their executive positions. So some of the other research that we know on executives is that I believe it's somewhere in the range of 50 to 60% of executives will fail in their first 18 months. And so if you are an executive, it means that you are feeling some level of difficulty, incompetence, you're not making the right decisions. And so that load actually will have a very great effect on you. And so if you look at your business life, you look at your personal life, and you say, I'm not measuring up, I'm not kind of meeting the standards that I intuitively want to meet, one of the reasons why pornography becomes so appealing is that it gives you exactly what you want when you want it, and nothing else on the planet offers you that.
So which is what? Let's talk about a hypothetical executive that's traveling in a city away from home that just had a tough day of whatever they were doing. They were hiring, they were firing, they were doing a strategy meeting, they were thinking all day long, they had 15 whiteboards filled up with story brand stuff, or whatever they did was a lot. And it's now 10 o'clock at night, they're tired, they're in their room, they flip on the television and it says, click here for the adult channel. They do, they watch a pornographic film, and at the end of the time, they're full of shame and wish they hadn't have done it. What if we rewind the tape to turning on the television or leaving the day stressed? What would you say they could do differently, think differently? You asked some questions in your book. How do I get out of here? How could they play the tape in a different way?
So, I mean, I think part of what I would say is that when you arrive in that hotel room, you need to check in with your body. So, how am I? How was my day?
Okay.
I had a really terrible day.
Uh-huh.
And so, one of the things that we think about with regard to sexual brokenness is a lot of people use the language of, I'm just doing it to self-medicate or to escape.
Yeah.
But the reality is, as one songwriter says, every gambler knows that to lose is what you're really there for. And so most people know that if they watch porn, if they have 3 or 4 drinks and then have some illicit behavior, they're going to feel terrible about who they are. And so I think part of how to engage that is to say, what if I didn't feel judgment at the end of a night? So I've been through a lot of stress. I've been through war today. What my body needs more than anything is comfort.
Okay.
And so that's where, when I work with executives that travel quite a bit, part of what I tell them is, I want your senses alive. We always have some choice.
Right.
And we can choose something that deadens ourselves and gives us the reinforcement of that judgment, or we can kind of begin to pursue something that brings rest and comfort to our bodies. And
Wow.
so that's
Wow.
the invitation, is that you don't need to feel worse. You don't need to contain your desire, but I would say, actually, like, invite your body to goodness, invite your body to kindness and to really good soothing.
So it starts off when you walk in the hotel room
Yeah.
to say, I had a terrible day. Kind of like that Australia book
Yeah.
for kids, right?
Yes.
I had an awful, terrible, no good day. I think I'm going to move to Australia.
Yes.
And so you say, I
Exactly.
had a bad day. I don't want to feel worse.
Yes.
So I'm going to do some things to kind of treat myself to feel better. And that might be even call your spouse, call your kids, call a friend. I know my pastor, Rick Warren, does not travel alone.
Okay.
So do some things that would be kind of a treat to yourself.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Because I mean,
Wow.
that's the point, is that most of us, when we are stressed, when we are not doing well, we actually pursue behaviors that reinforce that feeling. And so that's the main pivot that I want people to make, is, what if you actually pursued comfort?
Why do people pursue something that would make them feel worse? What's the psychographic of that?
Well, I think that's really this issue of shame, right? So when you are an executive, you have a lot of power, and yet you also feel some level of, if people really knew what I was doing, if people really knew how incompetent that I felt,
That I'm posing.
that I'm posing, that I'm an imposter, they would see through it, and then everything would crumble. And so if that's part of your identity, you're going to pursue behaviors that reconfirm that is your story.
Right.
And
So let's pursue that.
Yeah.
If everybody knew I was a poser, if everybody knew I was incompetent, if everybody knew I felt like a failure, even though I just did something great in front of 1,000 people at the company meeting, but if everybody knew the truth, so therefore tonight I will go to a strip club, or therefore tonight I will go to a massage parlor. How did we miss a step along that journey?
Yeah, the step being... Say more
Well,
about that.
the step being self-talk
Yeah.
that helps me push eject to get me to a better place.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to the important point that you raised at the beginning, is most of us, when we're in a difficult spot, we pursue entitlement. So I think of unwanted sexual behavior a little bit like a river. And one of the primary tributaries that flows into that river of unwanted sexual behavior is certainly lust.
Yeah.
But what we haven't had language, especially in Christian circles, to name is that there is power and anger that plays out as well. And so if you're only trying to curb your porn use or your massage parlor pursuits with just, I'm just going to stop lust, but you don't have language to see, there's actually a lot of anger, there's a lot of desire for power that's funneling you towards that, you're going to set yourself up to continually fail, because those parts of your life are actually left to fester in hiding. So this is the language of kind of James 4, is, what causes fights and quarrels among you? You desire, but you don't get what you want. And so what do? You kill. And I think that's what we need to have language to name, especially for people in leadership positions, is when you don't get what you want, you don't pursue healthy behaviors, but far more, you actually aren't loving and kind to people around you. And so I think if we can hold the complexity of, it's not only I who needs kindness, but how do we not exploit, how do we not use people in the midst of all the difficulties that we're facing? I think that will put us in a much better position to find something really healing instead of something that feels compulsive.
So our sexual fantasies are a roadmap.
Yes.
We need to listen to our lust. I love what you said in your book. Efforts to eliminate lust set us up to manage our sex life with a tourniquet.
Yes.
That was
Yeah.
a great quote.
Yeah. So, I mean, with regard to listening to your lust, I know people often are like, "What are you talking about?
What are you
We're supposed
talking
to
about?"
flee lust. We're supposed to run from it."
Yeah.
And that was some of the research findings. Is we looked at one of the most common search for terms on the internet had to do with kind of teens or college students, a race that suggested to someone's subservience, a petite body type. And so we looked at what are the key drivers of someone's pursuit of that behavior. And what we found were that those men had three primary categories. They were dealing with a lot of lack of purpose in life, they had high levels of shame, and they had a strict father. And so that becomes that thing, is you can just kind of imagine what it's like to be that person sitting in front of their phone, their computer, they come from a family system where there was a lot of authority that was used to kind of power over them. A lot of their own choice were taken away. They had to be subservient to an authoritarian father. And then they're dealing with a lot of difficulties in life. And this is kind of the language of Genesis 3, where, the curse for a man is thorns and thistles. So everything that we do is basically has some level of futility in it. Like by the sweat of your brow, blood is going to be your experience. And then in the midst of all that, we want to find relief. We want to find some arena of power to reestablish this difficulty that we're feeling. And so I think that's the invitation of this book, is to say your sexual brokenness and some of the specifics of what you're seeking out are actually reading your story, and they're inviting you to heal some of these stories of, maybe you have some wounds and some pain from childhood that needs to be addressed. Maybe they're, as this book outlines, if you're feeling unprepared, part of what that crucible is you need to get a team around you to help you sort through some of the complexities and problems that you're facing. Because if you go into isolation, you're just going to kind of set up your cycle of addiction. And so I think all these things that we're facing are actually invitations to us to find deeper healing and deeper competency than we would have originally chosen.
I'm glad you brought up Genesis 3,
Yeah.
because I do think that a lot of people think that if I had a bad day, that could have been a good day, should have been a good day, and tomorrow should be a good day and could be a good day. And as a matter of fact, if every day was a good day, my life would be better. But that's not what it says in Genesis 3, right?
No.
The ground, and many people get this mixed up. They say work is cursed, but work was never cursed. The ground was cursed. So if the ground was cursed, your iPhone might break, your car might have a flashing light on the dashboard that says engine malfunction.
Yes.
Your spouse might not be happy when you come home. Your kids might have got a D in physics. That was me, by the way.
In physics.
But things aren't always going to work. And so when things aren't working as an executive, it's time for us to say, that is because I'm living in a post-Genesis 3 world. Let's talk to some of the executives that are women who are listening today. Some of their issues are the same as men, no doubt about it, but some of them, God has ordained that the issues they may be struggling with in unwanted temptation type behavior are different than men. Speak to them.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what Genesis 3 outlines is that the curse for a man is much more about the ground. It's about work, the thorns and thistles. But the curse for a woman is really a relational curse. And so one of the statistics that really jumped out at me from this book, Rising to Power, is that 38% of executives felt like they were not prepared for the isolation and some of the loneliness of their career. And so I think if we hold that the reality of if you are a woman leading an organization, extremely lonely, extremely isolated for you. And what my research looked at was that we found that about 30% of porn users are now women. And then we also found that women who felt like their needs were not met, like they were not pursued by significant people in their life, they were nearly 5 times more likely to pursue an affair.
Wow.
And so I think that that's what we have to hold together is when you are an executive, a female executive at the top, and you have this experience of, just relational curse anyways of do people love me? Are they going to pursue me? Are my needs even important because I'm checking out for everybody's needs, my family's, my organizations? What about me?
Right.
That's a really, really difficult crucible to undergo. And what happens with unwanted sexual behavior is that you outsource that to an affair or to an unwanted sexual behavior. And the immediate feeling is, okay, I'm a little bit less alone because now I have someone that pursues me. But then at the end of the day, you feel more shame, you feel more isolated, and so the problem just keeps compounding. And so I think that that's really the invitation, especially to women, is do you know your needs? I would say this to men as well, but do you know how isolated you are? Do you feel lonely? And that's where I highly recommend that people just have a team of people around them, whether that's an executive coach, a licensed therapist, and really the quality of your friendships to be able to say, do you have other people that are bearing some of these burdens with you, and how are you confronting some of your own loneliness in your career? So again, I don't think that this isn't just an attempt to try and say there's something bad about what you've done, but it's if you find yourself allured and seduced to unwanted sexual behavior, that should be like an indicator light on a dashboard that just kind of says there's something that's a little bit off. What if you pursued wholeness and connection instead of unwanted sexual behavior?
So anything else you would say to women executives to look to the issues that might be unique to them? You talked about maybe loneliness being something that they would feel in a more magnified way than men.
Yeah.
And so pursuing a relationship with somebody, let me not say it that way. Let me say being alone for dinner with a male executive that reports to them, where they talk about their life and they talk about their loneliness, could be a gateway to failure.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, part of what we know from the research is that about 1 out of every 3 women have had some history of sexual abuse, sexual assault in their life. And so I think part of what we have to name is that a lot of times the earliest sexual experiences for a woman are not chosen, they're not wanted. And so what ends up getting established early in childhood and through sexual harm is basically violation, it's shame. And so what happens to a lot of women later in life is that they don't feel sexually alive unless there's some reenactment of that original harm. And so that's that kind of interplay of if you find yourself seduced into experiences that at the end of the day are going to lead to more shame and isolation. As a therapist, part of what I need to ask you is where did your sexual story go offline that's what you find most intimate and arousing? And so not only is that not a wise decision, I think far more it's this invitation to kind of say you're leading a company extremely well against so much adversity. What if you actually took time for yourself to begin to heal some of the pain that might be driving you to make compromised decisions with your sexual life?
Can we talk a little bit about shame?
Yes.
A friend of mine who's a psychologist in Southern California, works with executives all the time, says the holy grail of psychology is figuring out what to do about shame.
Sure.
And Bruce McNichol would say almost the same thing with different words, right? The author of the book True-Faced and The Cure. That when we figure out shame, we've really unlocked something that hasn't been well unlocked. This same friend of mine said he's read 100 books for his doctorate in psychology, and none of them figures out shame like the book The Cure. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, shame is this Brené Brown says it's this like painful experience that something about you is unworthy of love. And so most of us, when we even think about sharing a story from long ago, or even a story of like how you felt about yourself getting dressed this morning, have some experience of shame. And what happens in the midst of shame is that we end up living as prey to shame. And so you try to run away from its accusations, you try and hide the shame in the closet, and yet what the reality is that that sets you up to live as prey. And so what I kind of outline in Unwanted is that if we want to address shame, what we need to do is to turn towards it and face it. And there's this fascinating interview by this guy named Andy Casagrande, who's the videographer for the show Shark Week.
Okay.
So he films, in cold Pacific oceans with great white sharks swimming at him. And they said, Andy, what in the world do you do when you're swimming with great whites? And he says, it's counterintuitive, but you swim right at the shark with the camera. And so what he says is that if you're a great white shark, everything in the whole entire ocean swims away from you. So if you have something swimming towards you, it's like, what in the world is happening? And what happens is the shark bumps the camera, realizes that it's not food, and then has a defense mechanism of, I don't know what this thing is, and then it swims away. And to me, that has a lot to do to teach us about how to interact with shame, is that most of us try and run from it. But once we turn towards it and tell other people where we harbor it, the power of shame is reduced in our lives. And so that's really the invitation, is that you're going to feel shame often. But shame can also be a crucible for growth, and it can be a place where you actually invite good friends, a therapist, a mentor into some of those places where you harbor shame.
Right. So speak to the executive who they just had a shareholder meeting, they just had a board meeting, they just had a tough meeting, and it didn't go well, and they walk out of the room and they get in their car and they say to themselves, wow, I did not do that well. What would a good next thought be, instead of heading down a pathway that would be shame-laced, that might lead them to pornography or a massage parlor? What could something be that they say to themselves when they say, I did a horrible job?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I would invite them to do two things. The first is to really recognize what didn't go well in their meeting, to actually have some good rational thinking as to, was I not prepared? Was there someone else in that meeting that actually saw me lead? And maybe I did terribly, maybe I did really well, but I need some other voice to kind of help me understand what happened there. So
you might call a friend and say, how did I do?
How did I do? Or I felt like I wasn't prepared for this. And so how do I have some accountability the next time to be really well prepared, so that I'm not sabotaging the next big meeting?
Right.
But the other kind of important thing is that you have to engage your limbic brain, which is basically the emotional center. So when we are around threat, the brain does fight, flight, or freeze. So I want to kill someone because that didn't go well. I want to run away from this. I never want to go into another meeting, or I just freeze and I feel some sense of paralysis. Part of what the research would show is that if you're able to find, basically if you're able to breathe 8 times in 1 minute, so a big inhale, pause for a couple seconds at the top, exhale, you will actually send a message to your brain that says, all clear, everything is safe, you're going to be okay. And so most of us, after we come out of a big meeting, are very dysregulated. And so that's the invitation to kind of do a body scan of saying, where am I tense? Where am I crunched over? What if I expanded my chest? What if I breathed? And Dan Siegel has this wonderful phrase that says, name it to tame it. And so that's really, again, the invitation to say, there's something about me that's not well. And how do I kind of begin to find food, a type of beverage that would actually begin to soothe me? And I know a lot of times that's when people just go to gin and tonics and more dissociative behaviors.
Or ice cream.
Or ice cream, which again, as we've talked about, like that will just reinforce the experience of shame. And so that's the counterintuitive move that we need to make with shame, is not run from it, not to pursue more behaviors that confirm that core belief, but really to say, I need comfort right now. And so this is Jesus' words of blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That a lot of us try and get through life without mourning, without grieving, without kind of feeling the experience of loss. And that sets us up to find counterfeits all over the world.
Yeah, and I would add that if you're an executive that's trying to do good things for the kingdom of God, you're trying to love your employees, you're trying to serve them well, you're trying to be a friend to them on the journey, you're trying to pay them well, you're trying to create a place where they can find hope and meaning and purpose Monday to Friday, and then you have a bad board meeting and you feel terrible, no doubt about it that Satan is going to go after your mind and say, you're not doing well. And we need to take that biblical technology, that biblical verse that says, cast down vain imaginations, and go attack that, as you just said, and say, no, I'm okay. And call your spouse and head for a great dinner, or go to the beach and go for a walk, but don't say, yes, it was a terrible meeting, and I need to reward myself by massage parlor, by buying a magazine I shouldn't, by sexting, by taking my negative pathway really to destruction. So
and I mean, as you mentioned evil, I mean, that John 10:10, like the thief comes to steal, to kill, and destroy. And the word to destroy is really the sense of mar. And so one of my colleagues will talk about basically the work of evil is to go into an art museum, find a Picasso or a Van Gogh, and then just run a knife through it. It's that sense of wanting to mar something beautiful. And I think that that's what so many of us face when we're in difficulty, is that the thief wants to kill us, wants to destroy, wants to mar something really beautiful about our leadership, wants to mar something really beautiful about our sexuality. And so that becomes part of this kind of to go on the offensive, to say, I don't want some of the most beautiful and vulnerable parts of me, which are my ability to lead others and my sexuality, to be marred just because I had a really bad day. And so that I think is part of what the gospel is all about, is come unto me, all you who are weary, heavy laden. I want to give you rest. And so that's really the invitation, is where can you find rest in the midst of the difficulties that you're facing?
Great. So we're inviting executives to not choose this counterfeit path, which is interestingly way, way, way more available today than it was 100 years ago. I mean, if you think about it, I love what Randy Alcorn says. If I invited you, said, hey, Jay, I know there's a neighbor of mine that's having sex tonight, and we can watch them do that through the window. And you would say, we're not doing that. And you'd say, I was crazy. But what happens often is we go to an R-rated movie and watch that very thing because it can happen through the technology of movies. And Alcorn would say that wasn't true 100 years ago. So the availability of the internet, web, sexting, live webcams, all this stuff has made what wasn't available before very available now as a destructive choice. And we're calling executives, you're calling executives through your book Unwanted, to say, wait, stop, figure out why this is happening, figure out that your lust can be a roadmap, and stop rewarding yourself with things that are just going to cause more shame.
Exactly. And the last thing that I'll say about just this book, Rising to Power, again, is that they wanted to understand basically what power failure was. And they found that it went into two categories: either the classic leader that is really intimidating, that is toxic, that's authoritarian. But what they found was that that wasn't the greater power failure among most executives. The greater power failure was actually the abdication of power. So they were indecisive. They were overly accommodating of poor performance. And I think unwanted sexual behavior becomes that as well, is that if you abdicate your responsibility and your integrity, you're going to set yourself up for sexual failure and for also business failure. And so I think that, I mean, this is the way that our lives speak to us, is that if you're dealing with brokenness and abdicating integrity in your sexual life, very, very likely that you're also abdicating responsibility in your business life. And so that's the confluence of healing, is that we actually need to use our power and our positions much more efficiently and with more integrity than we currently do.
Maybe speak to the executive who says, I've been struggling, I've been memorizing Bible verses, I'm in an accountability group, I put a management system on my computer, I've been at it for 10 years, what could they do? And if going to one of your websites is a great idea, just bring it on.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is, like, when we are in the ruts of our unwanted sexual behavior, the story that's always at the forefront of our minds is our shame and our failure. And when that is the story that is in the forefront of our mind, we often think that all God wants from us is just kind of compliance and obedience. And so we project onto God this understanding that maybe you're just the board of directors that's disappointed in me, waiting for me to turn this whole thing around. But the reality is I mean, God's face is turned towards us with kindness. And that invitation is actually to unbelievable transformation. Like, that God doesn't invite us to suppress our desire. He's actually inviting us to, I mean, he gives us the keys to his entire kingdom, saying, where do you want to go with this one beautiful, stunning life that you have? And so I think that would be the first thing, is like, if you've tried a lot of tourniquet stuff, you've tried a lot of suppression of desire, the reason that doesn't work is because the way that our hearts are made are for beauty and for desire. So we have to begin there, that our desire, our sex life, these are really beautiful and good things. And so beyond that, I think part of what I would say is, just as our unwanted sexual behavior is not random, the journey to freedom is not random either. And so that was part of writing this book. But also I created basically an 18-episode e-course that with the Heart of Man film, to basically invite people to understand how their story is shaping their sexual choices. So this is a 5-month journey that people can go through. And I also created a unwanted sexual behavior self-assessment that's on my website. And so you complete this survey. It's about 160 questions that covers a lot of things from your basically the stories that you don't want to talk about, and then says how do all these things actually shape your involvement with unwanted sexual behavior. So it's going to give you a 40-page report that basically reads your life and says, here are the connections. So that's part of the course as well. And that's what we're finding, is that, you know, through 5 months, 6 months, find another executive, find someone else in your Convene groups to go through this with. But I think you'll be really surprised at what you find, because that's most of us try to change just through behavioral stuff, rather than really understanding our story and why we make the decisions that we make. So that course is called Journey into the Heart of Man, and people can find that at www.heartofmanjourney.com. Or my website is jay-stringer.com.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And it's been just a joy to be with you here in Seattle. And I just wish you all the best as you continue to make things happen in an area that I'm sure you probably have a couple people who thought maybe your approach was not like quite what they heard before. But I just want to encourage you and say, keep doing what you're doing. Executives from coast to coast and around the world need it. I'm sure you're hearing from them. But keep doing what you're doing, and we're raving fans of what you're doing at Convene.
Thank you so much. Such an honor and just delight to be with you today.